Living World Biodiversity. This is Unit 2, Topic 1, and we have a lot to cover in this presentation today. So let's start with the basics. To understand ecosystems is to understand species interactions. And the most common type of interaction is competition over limited resources, and we'll talk about some of those competitions and some of those resources today. This competition has led to an arms race in the natural world. And this is key to helping us understand the idea of biodiversity. Remember, most of us are familiar with biodiversity, but we don't think of it as being worthy of a whole unit out of 9 units. So what is biodiversity? It's also biological diversity. So if you hear those, they're interchangeable. It's the variety of life on Earth. More biodiversity equals more resistance to disturbances. So if something happens, like a fire or a flood, the more diverse an area is, the easier it is for it to overcome. Biodiversity is made of 3 main components. We have habitat diversity, we have genetic diversity, and we have species diversity. And being that you know all those words, I think that makes sense. And so now we're starting to break down what biodiversity actually is. So let's start with habitat diversity. Earth's diversity of biological communities such as deserts, grassland, forests, mountains, oceans, lakes, rivers, and wetlands, all the biomes that we learned, both the terrestrial and aquatic biomes, contribute to habitat diversity. And then the link between productivity and biodiversity is that the more productive an ecosystem or habitat is, so the more stuff that it's producing, more primary producers, the more species that it can support. More productivity gives more resources and more niches that need to be filled, and therefore can lead to more species diversity. If we have more things on the lowest trophic level, we can support more things on the higher trophic levels. Let's look at some vocab. Ecological niche. It's the total way of life or role of a species in an ecosystem. It includes all physical, chemical, and biological conditions that species need to live and reproduce in an ecosystem. And we saw this example when we see birds. Birds can partition the same resource to be able to make an ecological niche. A certain bird can live near the interior and near the trunk, and another bird can live up near the top and the perimeter. And that's their foraging height, and so they've developed their own ecological niche that works to share that one tree for those 5 types of birds. We all know that habitat loss is bad. Habitat loss equals a loss of biodiversity. And so just looking at those images, you can see that not every species is impacted by habitat loss at the same time or in the same way. Let's look at generalist and specialist species. Specialist species are species with very narrow niches and very specific requirements. They are extremely good at what they do, but are vulnerable to change. They need to have their very specific requirements met. They are the first to go due to habitat loss and disturbances. Generalist species are species with very broad niches that can use a wide array of habitats and resources. They have the ability to live in many different places, and they tend to be more adaptable to disturbances. And here are some examples. Okay, total specialist species has a very narrow range of things that it eats. Total generalist species, if the wild things that it wants to eat aren't available, it knows how to forage for them. Genetic diversity is another type of diversity that we have. It's the variety of genes found in a population or species. The more genetically diverse a population is, the better that population or species can deal with environmental disturbances. The genes that are necessary to deal with these stressors are more likely to be present in a genetically diverse population. This is where Darwin comes in. So if we start looking at natural selection, it's the survival of the fittest is kind of misleading. It's sort of you win the game when your offspring successfully reproduce. According to natural selection, those that are best able to do this will survive. Natural selection is the process by which traits that enhance survival and reproduction are passed on more frequently to future generations than those that do not. And biological evolution is the genetic change in populations of organisms across generations. So we have this evolution after we go through generations of populations. It can be random, or it can be influenced by natural selection. So randomly we could have evolution, or it can be influenced. So mutations are accidental changes in DNA that may be passed on to the next generation. They can accidentally happen, and if they're genetically inheritable, they can go on. Non-lethal mutations provide the genetic variation in which natural selection acts. We can have an adaptation, which is a trait that promotes reproductive success. In order for the trait to be passed on to the next generation, it must be heritable. So that adaptation must be something that has a genetic basis. And then we have fitness, the likelihood that that individual will reproduce. It's the number of offspring an individual will have in its lifetime. So fitness, remember, in a biology standpoint, means something different than we think of it today. It doesn't mean being physically fit. It's the number of offspring that that individual will have. And if we think back to the peppered moth lab that you should have been familiar with from biology, we see the little bird in the top corner, and the moths that have the genetic variation of being darker colored are easier for the bird to see, and so they get eaten more. But then what happened, if you see the factories in the background in the second picture, soot ended up on all the trees, and now those black moths were camouflaged and the white moths were more apparent. And so there was a selection that caused that genetic variation to change. Phylogeny is the family tree. So scientists can group species into categories in order to see how closely they are related. It tends to create a branching pattern like a tree, so we can see which things are more closely related. They're phylogenetic trees, and the closer two things are on the tree, the more closely related they are. If we take the definition of phylogenies and apply it to all living things, we can see that all living things share a common ancestor. So if we sort of map this tree out in the circle, we can see where the animals, the plants, the fungi, the protists, and we all come from some common ancestor. Genetic bottlenecks is a drastic decrease in genetic diversity for a population or a species due to a sudden decrease in population. It could be due to a natural disaster, it could be due to overhunting, or habitat destruction. The problems that happen with the bottleneck is that there is difficulty in adapting to ecosystem changes, there can be inbreeding, there can be harmful mutations, and population collapse. When we talk about species diversity, this is what most people think of when they hear the term biodiversity. So people think of just species diversity, the number and abundance of the different kinds of species living in an ecosystem. Ecosystems with more species are more likely to recover from disturbances. If there's less species, it's harder for them to recover than if there's more species in that area. Two ways of thinking of species diversity is species evenness and species richness. So what's the difference? Richness is the number of different species in an ecosystem, whereas evenness is a measure of the comparative abundance of all the species in an ecosystem. Let's look at that as a picture. Here's two communities. If we look at community 1, it has 25% of each of the types of trees. If we look at community 2, it has different percentages where that light green tree is sort of dominating. Both of them have the same species richness. They both have 4 types of trees, but community 1 has species evenness. It's just ways that are important for us to consider biodiversity, and not necessarily good or bad or otherwise. If you were an organism that needed one of those specialized trees, like that pine tree in the first example, or that other green tree that there's only one of in community 2, the biodiversity of community 2, even though it has the same species richness, would not be as beneficial to you. So for a recap, biodiversity refers to habitat, genetic, and species diversity. More productive and diverse habitats allow for more biodiversity. Habitat loss decreases biodiversity, but it impacts different species in different ways. The more genetically diverse a population is, the better able it is to be able to deal with disturbances. And natural selection leads to genetic diversity. Bottlenecks remove genetic diversity. And we can think of species diversity in terms of both species richness and species evenness. I know there's a lot about biodiversity and that there's a whole unit on it, but I think it's pretty interesting that we have all of these factors at play.